Horror is often understood as entertainment. This project approaches it differently, as a spatial system. Across decades, horror cinema has constructed a cultural geography, one that determines who is vulnerable, who survives, and where danger is located. Psycho establishes this logic early, and was the first real horror movie. It brings together psychological instability, gender deviance, and spatial isolation. It also marks a shift. The home is no longer safe, private space becomes unstable, and fear becomes embedded in everyday life. But before horror turned inward, it looked outward. Early horror cinema organizes fear through distance. The threat is not located within the self or within everyday life, it exists beyond it. The monster is positioned at the edge of society, defined by separation from what is considered normal, human, or acceptable. These figures are constructed as foreign, unnatural, and unknowable. In Dracula, fear is explicitly geographic and racialized. The vampire is framed as an outsider crossing into Europe, threatening social order, territorial boundaries, and sexual norms. The narrative reflects anxieties about invasion and contamination. In the early film adaptation Nosferatu, this logic becomes even more visually explicit. The monster is constructed through imagery associated with anti-Semitic stereotypes, including exaggerated features, parasitic behavior, and associations with disease. Fear here is not abstract, but embodied through racialized and cultural difference. In stories and films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man, the focus shifts from the foreign body to the dangerous mind, and the scientist becomes a site of fear. These narratives reflect anxiety about intellectual ambition, specifically what happens when knowledge exceeds natural or moral limits. Across these films, a consistent structure emerges. Fear is projected outward, the monster is external to the social body, and the threat appears containable. This reflects early 20th century anxieties: fear of the unknown, fear of the foreign, and fear of uncontrolled knowledge and the intellectual. Horror at this stage does not ask the audience to see themselves in the monster, it asks them to recognize and reject it.
It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
Yes.
With Psycho, the distance collapses. The threat is no longer located in distant landscapes or external figures. It exists within an ordinary domestic setting, within an individual mind. The film shifts horror from the outside world into the interior, both spatially and psychologically. The motel, the house, and the body itself become sites of instability.
Why was he dressed like that?
He's a transvestite.
Not exactly. A man who dresses in women's clothing in order to achieve a sexual change or satisfaction is a transvestite. But in Norman's case, he was simply doing everything possible to keep alive the illusion of his mother being alive. He tried to be his mother. And now he is.
This moment attempts to provide explanation, but it also reveals the constraints of representation. At the time, direct depictions of queerness, gender nonconformity, and complex psychological identity were limited by censorship and cultural norms. As a result, these identities are not presented explicitly. They are translated into something indirect. This is the function of cinematic coding. Queerness becomes implication rather than declaration. Gender nonconformity is reframed as disguise or pathology, and psychological instability becomes the dominant explanatory framework. Meaning is communicated through gesture, performance, and narrative framing rather than direct identification. Over time, these representational strategies produce consistent patterns. Difference must be visually signaled, ambiguity becomes associated with instability, and non-normative identity becomes linked to danger. This is not incidental, it is structural. From this point, horror does not just depict difference, it standardizes it. Psycho establishes a system in which fear is organized through the identification and exposure of deviance. The film brings together surveillance, gender, and space. The body is watched, categorized, and ultimately punished. This reflects a broader pattern in horror cinema. Horror does not simply reflect cultural ideas about gender, it actively produces and stabilizes them through repetition. Following Psycho, horror increasingly turns towards spaces that were previously considered safe, especially the home and its surrounding environments. The central shift is not only thematic, but spatial. Safety itself becomes unstable. Films like The Exorcist, The Amityville Horror, and Poltergeist establish the domestic space as penetrable. The home is no longer protective, it is invaded by supernatural or unseen forces. Fear is no longer external to everyday life, it is embedded within it. At the same time, a parallel cycle of 1970s horror pushes this logic outward into the landscape and the body. In films like The Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave, violence is staged within isolated spaces at the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Rather than relying on supernatural threats, both films locate horror in the human behavior that emerges from environments marked as outside the social order. I Spit on Your Grave places particular emphasis on the vulnerable female body, linking femininity to violence, punishment, and survival.
Hello.
Are you in the house alone? Are you in the house alone?
We never did get to court. Philip Lawver pleaded guilty to assault, so they threw out the rape charge. But even though I lost, it was worth it to get it all out in the open. Phil left school after Thanksgiving. Someone said he went crazy and they put him away. But Steve and I don't think that's what happened. Somebody else said his folks sent him to a boarding school in New Hampshire. That's probably where he is. After it was all over, I asked Jessica how come the law protects the rapist and not the victim. And she said, because the system is wrong.
In Are You in the House Alone, the threat returns to domestic space, but in a more psychological form. The danger is no longer clearly visible, it is embedded in everyday environments and interpersonal relationships, reinforcing the idea that safety cannot be assumed even within familiar spaces. Across these films, horror dissolves the boundary between safety and threat. The home is no longer secure, the landscape is no longer neutral, and the body is no longer protected. Fear becomes distributed across all spaces, reorganizing how vulnerability is perceived and experienced. By the mid-1970s, horror shifted away from classic monsters and towards human figures whose violence is embedded within recognizable social spaces. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Black Christmas, the monster is no longer external nor inhuman. Instead, horror emerges from within human environments, domestic spaces, rural isolation, and fractured social order. However, at this stage, the slasher form is still unstable. The rules are not yet fixed. That consolidation happens with Halloween. Halloween functions as the formal stabilization of the slasher system. It reorganizes earlier experiments into a coherent structure. Suburban space becomes deceptive rather than safe. Violence becomes repetitive and spatially mapped. The killer becomes abstracted into a persistent figure of pure evil.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
And survival becomes tied to discipline, observation, and endurance. Michael Myers is central to this shift. He is human in form, but stripped of psychological explanation. This produces a new kind of monster. Not fully supernatural, not fully human, but structurally unreadable. He is defined not by motive, but by presence. This is the turning point of horror. From this moment onward, the genre no longer experiments with instability, it standardizes it. After Halloween, the slasher genre becomes a repeatable framework and causes the slasher boom. In Friday the 13th, violence becomes explicitly tied to moral and spatial transgression. Youthful or deviant spaces are punished through systematic elimination. In Prom Night, Terror Train, and Sleepaway Camp, identity is further destabilized through masking, misrecognition, and narrative ambiguity. These films depend on uncertainty: who is safe, who is deviant, and who is legible. At the same time, queer coding becomes structurally embedded. Because explicit representation of gender nonconformity and sexuality is constrained, difference is displaced into implication. Ambiguity becomes suspicion, and suspicion becomes threat.
Please, God.
This is God.
By the mid-1980s, the system begins to mutate rather than disappear. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, spatial logic collapses entirely. The killer enters dreams. Fear is no longer tied to external geography, but to internal psychological space. In Hellraiser, horror shifts towards embodiment, desire, and transformation. The body itself becomes unstable, no longer simply threatened, but reconfigured through pain and excess. The original novel portrays these themes even deeper, but it had to be simplified for cinema rating. But these films only expand the slasher logic rather than replace it. Across this system, horror organizes identity through repetition and performance. In 1992, Carol J. Clover creates the term "final girl" in Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film, which has been used to understand modern and historical horror ever since. There is a direct parallel between mainstream feminism's construction of the universal woman and horror's construction of the final girl. White, middle-class women historically position themselves as the representative subject of feminism, and similarly, the archetypal final girl is often white, conventionally attractive, and coded as morally pure. She becomes the default site of empathy, protection, and narrative survival. And this is not incidental. It reflects whose vulnerability is culturally legible and whose survival is narratively prioritized. As Clover argues, gender in horror is not fixed, it is produced through narrative structure. Two roles dominate: the killer, unstable, coded, unreadable, often marked by deviance or ambiguity, and the survivor or final girl, disciplined, observant, and narratively legible. From this point, horror is no longer exploring difference, it is organizing it into a stable system of spatial and bodily fear. Horror does not only construct threatening figures, it constructs space. Jaws demonstrates how quickly an environment can be redefined. The ocean and sharks become a site of fear, reshaping how audiences perceive and interact with them. Alien extends this logic into outer space, transforming the spaceship into a closed environment defined by isolation, corporate surveillance, and constant threat. This is the production of Geographies of Fear. Horror teaches where danger exists, how space should be navigated, and what environments should be avoided. It's important to note that horror outside the United States develops along different but equally complex lines. A prime example of this is Godzilla. Here, fear is not centered on individual deviance or domestic instability, but on collective trauma, specifically nuclear destruction and environmental catastrophe. In Godzilla, the monster is not simply other, it is a production of historical violence and technological power. A larger conversation about horror in the global context needs to be a topic for another video, but the main point is that while horror consistently organizes fear through bodies and space, the meanings of those fears are shaped by specific cultural and historical contexts.
Have you ever heard of Candyman?
No.
Well, his right hand is sawn off. He has a hook jammed in the bloody stump. And if you look in the mirror and you say his name 5 times, He'll appear behind you, breathing down your neck.
By this point, horror has established a durable system. It has mapped fear onto specific spaces, linked identity to threat, and structured survival through performance. What follows is not a break from the system, but its expansion into race, history, and contemporary forms of representation.
Do I know you?
No. No. But you doubted me.
I'm sorry, I have to go.
No need to leave yet.
But I'm late.
You are not content with the stories, so I was obliged to come. Be my victim. Be my victim.
Candyman is adapted from Clive Barker's The Forbidden, but relocates its narrative from England to Chicago. The shift is not simply geographical, it resituates the story within a landscape already structured by segregation, racial inequality, and historically produced spatial division. From its release, the film generated controversy. It draws on familiar cultural images of urban violence and positions a black male figure as the central site of horror, while simultaneously attempting to expose the social and historical anxieties that produced those associations. The tension remains unresolved. The film both critiques and reproduces the structure it engages. Fear in Candyman is anchored to place. The city is not continuous or evenly experienced, but divided through visible and invisible boundaries between wealth and poverty, white and black communities, and spaces that are maintained versus those that are systematically neglected. Cabrini Green is central to this spatial logic. It is not introduced as an unknown or neutral environment, but as a space already constructed through cultural narratives of danger, instability, and crime. Before any violence occurs, the location has already been rendered legible as threatening through external discourse. The film does not simply reproduce this framing, it exposes how it is formed. Fear circulates through stories, media representation, and collective perception, transforming a material location into a symbolic site of danger. The neighborhood becomes less a place than an idea, one shaped by repetition, distortion, and cultural memory. The figure of Candyman, Daniel Robitaille, emerges from this system. He is not external to it, he is generated by it. His origin is rooted in historical violence, lynching, racial terror, and the policing of interracial desire. And these events are not contained in the past, they persist through repetition, returning as narrative structure and embodied memory. As a result, Candyman exists in contradiction. He is both victim and aggressor, both the product of violence and its continuation. His presence does not resolve historical trauma so much as restage it within the logic of horror. At the same time, the film remains entangled with the very associations it critiques, particularly fears of urban space, racialized violence, and social disorder. These meanings are not simply dismantled, they are activated and reworked within the film's structure. Fear, then, is not located in a single figure or event. It is embedded in the relationships between space, history, and representation, where the city itself becomes a site through which cultural anxieties are continuously produced and reproduced. What Candyman ultimately makes visible is that horror does not simply depict fear, it organizes it through shared cultural knowledge regarding where danger is supposed to exist and what form it is supposed to take. These meanings circulate beyond the film itself, shaping how audiences learn to recognize threats before narrative even begins. This is where horror begins to shift from producing fear to making its own systems apparent.
Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? You don't... Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no!
I'm a dead man.
Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. No, the sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Scream makes the system visible and identifies the patterns that have structured horror for decades. Who dies, who survives, and why. However, visibility does not equal disruption. Even when it acknowledges these rules, the film continues to reproduce them. The genre still privileges white femininity as the central site of vulnerability, codes deviance as danger, and stabilizes fear through repetition.
I said, and why do you want to do this film, Lars? I said, what do you, he said, well, because this is the, he said, this is the character closest to myself. And he said, except I don't kill people. I said, okay. And he said that most of the male characters that he had created in his previous films were idiots, and this was the character closest to him.
The representation of men within the horror genre is rather complicated. Long-term engagement with these films has fundamentally influenced my interpretation of character archetypes and story arcs. Predictability often defines these narrative structures. In many instances, male roles are restricted to specific functions. They appear as either the antagonist killer or as a disposable victim. Furthermore, these characters are frequently depicted as ineffective or narrative targets for punishment even when their violence is defensive. They typically serve as secondary support for the final girl before their inevitable demise.
It's okay, Darren. I got her.
Sid, he's lying. Sid, untie me. Sid, untie me.
Boyfriend killer.
Additionally, the boyfriend or main love interest is typically positioned as a potential threat. The expectation of the untrustworthy boyfriend has been reinforced repeatedly in the horror genre, to the point where suspicion becomes part of the viewing experience. While watching Happy Death Day, I could not believe that the geek's pseudo-love interest was not revealed to be the killer in the end of the film because of how ingrained this is in the genre. But even if the geek gets the girl, they still usually end up dead. This creates a narrow representation of men, being either predatory, expendable, or restricted in their potential.
Lady, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store.
Who the hell are you?
Name's Ash. Housewares.
However, notable exceptions exist. Characters like Ash in The Evil Dead or Herbert West in Reanimator contradict these roles. They are not idealized figures, but ordinary individuals placed in extreme circumstances. Jesse Walsh in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 further complicates masculine positioning within horror. Unlike the dominant or aggressive male protagonists common to other films, Jesse is defined through vulnerability and fear. The film's heavy queer coding and emphasis on possession transforms him into a figure structurally closer to the final girl than traditional male heroes. The works of Stephen King present many relatable and sometimes conflicted male characters, but they are still usually heroic figures. More recent examples introduce further variation. The Black Phone presents a younger male protagonist, but also gives some psychological depth to the antagonist. In television, shows like Dexter add depth to the relationship between protagonist and killer, blurring moral boundaries and relatability. Noah in the Scream TV series represents a significant departure from these rigid patterns. As a meta-aware character, he occupies a space typically reserved for the final girl or the geek archetype, yet he survives in the end by utilizing his deep knowledge of horror tropes. Unlike the disposable male characters in most franchises, Noah's survival is tied to his intellectual labor and his role as the narrative's moral and analytical center.
Here, take this.
Okay. But in observation of this loaded moment, I am not in favor of splitting up, nor am I 3 days from retiring. I will not be right back.
Other protagonists further subvert masculine norms. Andy Barclay in the Child's Play franchise survives through vulnerability and persistence rather than domination. Similarly, Mike in Five Nights at Freddy's is defined by trauma and caregiving rather than traditional heroism. These characters reflect a shift where male roles increasingly encompass fear and emotional fragility instead of mere physical control. While contemporary horror provides more psychological depth, traditional slasher logic still casts a long shadow. Patterns like the untrustworthy boyfriend or heroic sacrifice continue to shape audience perceptions of male characters even within these modern subversions. The boyfriend was also one of the killers in the Scream TV series. One of horror's most persistent effects is its shaping of social and spatial perception. The genre repeatedly suggests that both private and public spaces are dangerous. The home is vulnerable to invasion, while public environments remain sites of threat and exposure. This contrasts with research in feminist geography, which demonstrates that violence, particularly against women, is more likely to occur within private, domestic spaces. Horror, however, portrays danger as omnipresent across all environments. From early folklore to modern horror cinema, natural landscapes are consistently framed as inherently threatening, especially to women. Isolation becomes synonymous with vulnerability, and distance from domestic space is coded as heightened risk. Contemporary horror continues to reproduce this spatial logic, often through more stripped-back and psychologically focused forms. In films like The Blair Witch Project and Antrum, the threat is not fully visible or stable. Instead, it is distributed across the environment. The forest becomes a space where nothing can be identified, and therefore everything becomes potentially dangerous. The extended shots of the natural environment of In a Violent Nature remove clarity altogether. There is no immediate threat, no clear object of fear, only space. And this absence becomes the source of tension, because it reactivates an earlier structure of fear, one in which danger does not need to be seen to be felt. It reflects and reinforces the idea that danger exists out there in unfamiliar environments, rather than within the everyday structures where violence more commonly occurs. In this way, the wilderness functions as a displaced geography of fear, absorbing anxieties that are socially and domestically produced. The dangers of private space continue to be portrayed in the genre as well, furthering horror's ability to produce geographies of fear. Contemporary franchise supernatural horror continues to anchor fear in domestic space, reinforcing the home as a site of instability rather than protection. Even when framed through supernatural intrusion, the underlying spatial logic remains consistent. Safety is always conditional. I also think it's interesting to examine contemporary haunted horror films in relation to those of the 1970s and 80s, particularly in terms of how spatial instability and domestic threat have evolved over time.
She told me the other day, she wonders, what's your favorite scary movie?
The Babadook. It's an amazing meditation on motherhood and grief.
Isn't that a little fancy pants?
Well, it's elevated horror.
What does that mean, elevated horror?
You know, it's like scary, but with complex emotional and thematic underpinnings. It's not just some schlocky cheeseball nonsense with wall-to-wall jump scares.
That sounds kind of boring to me. Have you ever seen Stab?
Contemporary horror increasingly begins to expose the very systems it once reinforced. Films like The House That Jack Built foreground this awareness directly.
Mistake.
Me getting in this car with you. What was it one's mother used to say about not getting into cars with strangers?
Well, I wouldn't know what your mother said.
You might as well be a serial killer. I'm sorry, but you do kind of look like one.
That scene reveals how deeply visual codes of threat have already been internalized. Danger is not identified through action alone, but through appearance, through culturally learned assumptions about what violence is supposed to look like. In this sense, audiences are trained to read threats through specific markers: appearance, race, gender expression, and social behavior.
Do you think that clown was real?
See? I knew this was gonna come back to bite me. No, it's just make-believe. Demons, witches, monsters, that doesn't exist.
But he wasn't really a monster if you think about it. Like a vampire or a werewolf. He was just a man in a costume. Someone like that could really exist, right?
This scene shows how horror encourages audiences to accept certain bodies as naturally aligned with monstrosity, as if evil must have a recognizable form. This logic is even more self-aware in the Scream franchise.
Yeah. It's a bummer it's me.
It really was the best choice for the movie.
You really should have listened to Dewey. He nailed it in one. Dude, look at the love interest. Are you fucking stupid?
The franchise acknowledges that audiences have been conditioned to suspect certain archetypes and that the storytelling itself often conforms to those expectations in order to feel correct or satisfying. The opening of Barbarian is effectively precise because it relies on this conditioning. It assumes that the viewer already understands who is supposed to be dangerous and which spaces are unsafe. The film then destabilizes those assumptions by refusing to align the threat with the expected figure or location. This raises a central question: is a white, unstable male the assumed best choice for the movie? In other words, how much of horror's tension depends not on what is shown, but how deeply audiences have already been taught to recognize, and sometimes misrecognize, danger.
You know, there is something that has been bothering Mr. Sophistication for quite a bit. And perhaps it's more interesting to him than it would be to you. But to be honest, he gets pretty fucking pissed when he thinks about it. Why is it always the man's fault? No matter where you go, it's like you're some sort of wandering, guilty person without even having harmed a single kitten. I actually get sad when I think about it. If one is so unfortunate as to have been born male, and you're also born guilty, think of the injustice in that. Women are always the victims, right? And man, they're always the criminals.
They didn't ask me if I liked that.
It's because there's no way a girl could have killed him.
That is so sexist. The killer could easily be female. Basic instinct.
That was an ice pick. Not exactly the same thing. Yeah, Casey and Steve were completely hollowed out. And the fact is, it takes a man to do something like that.
These exchanges reveal how horror films actively construct and negotiate assumptions about gender and violence. Even within a self-aware film, characters default to the idea that killing is structurally coded as masculine, either through physical strength or a male mentality. Tatum's interruption exposes the contradiction, but it does not fully dismantle it. It simply acknowledges the framework while remaining inside it. The reference to basic instinct is especially significant here. It points to how female violence in cinema is often treated as exceptional, eroticized, or narratively suspect rather than normalized. Even when female killers appear, they are frequently framed through sexual deviance, psychological instability, or manipulation rather than structural capacity for violence.
Serial killers are typically white males.
That's why it's perfect. It's sort of against the rules, but not really. Mrs. Voorhees was a terrific serial killer, and there's always room for Candyman's daughter.
The reveal of Mrs. Voorhees in Friday the 13th was completely unexpected, and she is terrific because her violence remains legible through clear motivation, something that remains true for many killers across the Scream franchise. In this sense, Scream is less interested in simply revealing the killer than in exposing what makes killers predictable, recognizable, and narratively compelling. Contemporary horror increasingly expands this logic.
This patient has an inoperable frontal lobe tumor extending across the midline.
He's a very interesting person. His name is John.
Sick bastard.
Yes, I'm sick, officer.
Stop! Like, it's easier!
Sick from the disease eating away at me inside. Sick of people who don't appreciate their blessings. Sick of those who scoff at the suffering of others. I'm sick of it all.
Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. But not you. Not anymore.
Are you grateful, Mandy?
Helped me.
Please don't kill me.
That's the last thing that you should be worried about. Now, I want to play a game.
Across the Saw franchise, John Kramer is not presented as a purely irrational force of violence, but as a figure framed through trauma, illness, morality, and philosophical justification. The films repeatedly reorient the audience towards Kramer's perspective, encouraging viewers to understand the internal logic of his violence even if they disagree with it. At this stage, horror no longer depends entirely on the unknowable monster. The antagonist becomes psychologically legible.
Can you please tell me what's happening?
Oh, no, now that I know who you are, I'm happy to explain. So I was watching a show called Dexter, and there's this really interesting guy who kills bad people in order to make himself feel better, right? And your cousin John is a very bad doctor. He drugs his male patients and does bad things to them. So I thought, maybe I'll try it. I'll feel better like Dexter. And then I remembered that movie where the guy traps the two other guys in the room, and there's puzzles and a dead body.
I saw that movie.
Oh my God. Oh my God. This is gonna be a good day.
Yeah.
You have a really nice, kind face.
I walked back towards town, and a man pulled over to offer me a ride. He had a nice, kind face. And as he opened the door, he said something to me. I'll never forget it. He said, "Oh my God. Oh my God. This is gonna be a good day."
Oh, that's Peach Fuzz. That's just Peach Fuzz. Say hello.
This shift continues in films like Creep, where horror emerges through figures who appear disarmingly ordinary rather than monstrous. The threatening presence here is not marked by spectacle or overt deviation, but by behavioral awkwardness, emotional instability, and unsettling familiarity. Horror is produced through proximity rather than recognition. Danger no longer depends on visibly coded monstrosity, but on the instability of interpreting everyday social behavior.
Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed. God, who is the surge's role, deign to save our suppliant soul. To 4 weeks. Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed. God, who hears the surgeon's roll, deign to save the suppliant soul.
At the same time, contemporary horror increasingly shifts inward, becoming more psychological, cerebral, and formally intricate. Films like The Lighthouse merge spatial and psychological boundaries through repetition, hallucination, fragmented temporality, and emotional deterioration. Horror is not simply located within a monster or location, but within perception itself. Space becomes unstable because subjectivity becomes unstable. This evolution is not only narrative, but technical and aesthetic. Contemporary horror increasingly relies on atmosphere, sound design, ambiguity, framing, editing, rhythms, and spatial distortion rather than direct revelation alone. Fear emerges more through formal construction than through plot. The genre becomes visually and structurally intricate in ways that distinguish it from earlier cycles built more heavily around recognizable archetypes and confrontation.
Have you heard this song before?
You just played it.
I mean before tonight. I disagree. I think you've heard it many, many times before, but we will come back to that.
Films like Heretic and Late Night with the Devil further enhance contemporary horror through audience identification itself. In Late Night with the Devil, Jack Delroy initially serves as the protagonist and a sympathetic media figure. The film aligns viewers with his ambition, grief, and desperation before gradually revealing the extent to which he has sacrificed others and ultimately himself in pursuit of fame, success, and spectacle. The horror emerges not from an immediately recognizable monster, but from the slow realization that the central figure has been morally compromised from the beginning. Similarly, Heretic's Mr. Reed complicates traditional expectations of villainy by presenting as intellectually engaging, articulate, and emotionally persuasive. Rather than appearing threatening in a conventional sense, he becomes compelling through conversation, philosophy, and interpersonal charisma. This produces unstable audience alignment, as viewers may sympathize with a dangerous figure. I initially liked Mr. Reed and felt disappointed when the narrative framed him as definitively evil. When I later showed the film to my father, he had a similar reaction. This indicates a major change in modern horror. Relatability can now shift from heroes to villains.
So, no, I will not accept that you stand there and tell me that you never heard The Air That I Breathe by the Hollies, when I know that you have heard Creep by Radiohead. Oh yes, you have. Come on. But I'm a creep. Huh? I'm a weirdo. Okay. What the hell am I doing here?
But contemporary horror is not a linear progression from simple monsters to complex psychology. It is a layered system in which different historical logics coexist. Earlier horror forms are not replaced, they are reactivated alongside newer modes of representation. Through franchises, remakes, spiritual successors, and creature features, pure evil figures persist, but with psychological instability, social realism, and ambiguous perception all operating simultaneously within the genre's contemporary landscape. At this point, horror can no longer be understood only through its internal evolution of monsters or narrative structures. This opens into a broader reorientation, one that moves beyond character and perception toward the spatial, racial, and historical production of fear itself.
Get out.
Modern black horror emerges at the point where horror can no longer be understood only through its internal evolution of monsters or narrative structures, and the question shifts from what horror depicts to what cultural systems determine where fear is located, how it is recognized, and which bodies become readable as threats in the first place. Through a black feminist geography lens, space is never neutral. It is lived, embodied, and structured through history of race, gender, and control. Horror in this context becomes a way of reading how those spatial hierarchies are experienced from within. In Get Out, the suburban home is reconfigured as a site of liberal containment. It appears open, safe, and progressive, yet functions as a space of surveillance and extraction. The danger is not external intrusion, but internal structure, a spatial order that demands compliance through politeness, silence, and racial performance. Movement within the space is regulated not by force, but by expectation. In Us, space becomes explicitly divided. The world is split into mirrored geographies, above and below, visible and hidden, comfort and abandonment. The tethered are not simply monsters, but populations produced by spatial neglect, a group that exists because they have been displaced from livable space. Horror here emerges from inequality made architectural. The surface world depends on the invisibility of what exists beneath it. Sinners continues this logic through the navigation of landscapes shaped by historical violence and survival. Space is not only something characters move through, but something that actively structures risk, memory, and moral constraint. The body becomes a site where geography and history converge. Across these films, black feminist geography becomes central to how horror operates. It emphasizes that marginalized bodies do not experience space uniformly. They move through layered vulnerabilities where safety is conditional and visibly uneven. Modern black horror translates this into form. Spatial experience is embodied, relational, and historically produced. This marks a shift from earlier horror structures that often position black characters at the margins of narrative space. Here, spatial control itself becomes the subject. The genre no longer simply stages fear within environments, it questions who has the right to occupy them.
When something leaves a stain, even if you wash it out, it's still there. You can feel it, a thinning deep in the fabric. This neighborhood got caught in the loop. The shit got stained in the exact same spot, over and over, until it finally rotted from the inside out. They tore down our homes so they could move back in. We need Candyman.
The Candyman remake extends this by linking space to historical memory, showing how landscapes are marked by racial violence that persist beneath contemporary surfaces. In Scream the TV series and It Welcome to Derry, space continues to function as a site where history and systemic exclusions surface through horror logic, even when reframed through franchise or expanded universe storytelling.
No, I got you.
The result is not only a diversification of horror narratives, but a remapping of fear itself, where danger is no longer simply located within the space, but produced by the way space is organized, remembered, and controlled. The climax of Get Out epitomizes this. When the supposed police car arrives, racialized expectations immediately frame the scene, signaling danger based on cultural associations between blackness and suburban space. The tension arises from the audience's assumptions rather than authority itself. When Rod is revealed as the driver, the moment exposes how deeply those assumptions have already been internalized.
Stu's flipped out. He's gone mad.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
No, Billy!
Fuck!
Anthony Perkins, Psycho.
Across its contemporary forms, horror becomes increasingly self-aware of the systems it operates within. Fear is no longer organized only through isolated monsters or individual violence, but through histories, institutions, spatial hierarchies, and cultural perception itself. By this point, horror has moved far from the classic monsters that define the genre's early structure, and contemporary reinterpretations have increasingly complicated those figures as well. The monster no longer functions only as something to fear, but increasingly as something audiences may understand, sympathize with, or even identify with. The enduring lesson of horror is in its internal logic. Fear is more than a cinematic representation, it is a structured system dictated by how we interpret space, physicality, and meaning. The core of horror remains a structured system that dictates how we interpret space, bodies, and risk. Despite broader representation, the genre still categorizes bodies based on spatial presence and inherent vulnerability. From folklore to psychological horror, the genre repeatedly constructs geographies of fear, unsafe spaces, vulnerable people, and environments coded by instability and exclusion. Ultimately, horror functions as a form of spatial pedagogy. It instructs audiences to process fear through structural patterns that persist even as the genre evolves through critique and disruption.
I haven't come here to stop you from anything. I just have one question.
What's the question?
Wasn't there something about you building a house? Wasn't Jack going to build a house?
Yes. I was trying. Then I didn't get very far.
There are exceptions, there are disruptions, some films resist these patterns, but the structure persists, and horror continues to teach us where to fear, who to fear, and how to move through space because of it. Horror cinema has evolved significantly across its history and remains one of the few genres that illustrate the cultural logics through which fear is organized, embodied, and understood.
The old cathedrals often have sublime artworks hidden away in the darkest corners for only God to see. You kill art by imposing your moral ruler on life, which I want to free, because art is so immeasurably vaster than we will ever understand. May I illustrate now?
There's no avoiding it, is there?